Okay, y'all, this is going to be the last lecture in Unit 3. So this is going to be on the Federalist era. We're basically going to cover George Washington's presidency and John Adams's presidency up to what we call the Revolution of 1800. And yes, let's get going. So the last we talked about was the Anti-Federalist and the Federalist. Not the Federalist, but anyway. I'll go back and fix that. So this is the first party system. A lot of people, let's fix that. Anyway, a lot of people talk about like the Anti-Federalists. Well, what were the Anti-Federalists? That was just two sides of a debate, and they are not like a political party. The purpose of a political party is to get people elected and to kind of organize government. The Federalists versus Anti-Federalists were just a debate over the Constitution, and the Constitution is going to be ratified. It becomes the law of the land, and then it becomes a part of, interpreting the Constitution. So when we're looking at how are we going to live with this Constitution, it becomes kind of two differing points of view emphasized by two differing people. One is Jefferson, and one is Hamilton. So the Democratic Republicans are going to become one of the political parties, and this is kind of headed by Jefferson. And then the Federalist is going to be Hamilton, and the other people are going to be John Adams, right? And I think one of the things to remember is that, so these guys, Hamilton, John Adams, and I would even put Washington over here, right? These guys are the Federalists. Democratic Republicans are Jefferson, and I think significantly we need to mention Madison, right? So when we were talking about the Constitution, right, Madison and Hamilton were buddies, right? Madison and Hamilton were together. They were both writing the Federalist Papers. But when it comes down to interpreting the Constitution, Madison is going to be aligning himself with Jefferson. We're kind of going to go over that later. So this is it's different than the others. And it starts with kind of two differing personalities. You have Jefferson, who's a Virginia planter or like a slave owner. He, is out in a more rural area. He, is a tobacco planter. He's involved in Virginia politics. And he wrote the Declaration of Independence. Hamilton is kind of like rises from nothing. He was orphaned. He is living in New York. He's much more urban. He is, educated. And he worked with Washington during the war. Both are patriots. Both were, founding fathers, but they are going to have a differing interpretation of how this nation should be run. So when we get to Washington, he is obviously our first president. He comes into office in 1789, and Washington does not need a political party. Washington, essentially the presidency was created for Washington. When the nation was looking for a strong leadership, when they were thinking of should we have an executive, they basically made the kind of executive in the idea that we need someone like Washington to sort of help the nation through these times. So Washington overwhelmingly gets elected into office. First, he does not need a political party, and the Constitution does not think about political parties when it was created, and we'll see kind of more examples of that later. So Washington is president, and he just decides, you know what, I am going to try to surround myself with the smartest people I know. He's a general. He's used to having advisors around him. And so he's smart. He's like, I'm going to create a cabinet of advisors. I am going to put Jefferson in as my Secretary of State. Secretary of State deals with foreign policy. Jefferson was already in, France. He is very much in that. Then he makes Alexander Hamilton, one of his right-hand men in the war effort, Secretary of Treasury to try to get the economy going. Knox is going to be Secretary of War. So he gets the smartest people he knows, and he surrounds himself with them. And I think just kind of showing that he got Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton on his cabinet shows that he does not have a political party when he enters into office. Pretty immediately, we start to see differing opinions in how things should be run. And this has to do with, foreign policy and domestic policy, or what's happening in the country. So the first foreign policy issue has to do with France, which the Democratic Republicans support France, and England, which the Republicans, the Federalists, are going to sorry, I need to like edit this. The Federalists are going to support England. So yeah, so note to self, change that. All right. So the French Revolution happens almost right as Washington is coming into office. And so the United States has to think about how is it going to react to the French Revolution. If you remember back to the American Revolution, this is an echo from, the American Revolution to France. They're going to be using the language of freedom and natural rights. It is definitively like an echo coming from America to France. Now, it is a much different sort of revolution. It looks a lot different than the American Revolution. It is a very radical revolution. It's estimated as many as 40,000 people are executed under the guillotine. These include religious leaders, and in the Reign of Terror, obviously the king is going to be killed, Marie Antoinette is going to be killed, and this kind of chaos is also going to lead to Napoleon rising to power. So the French Revolution is happening, and probably bigger than that, we are also going to have the Napoleonic Wars, which are going to pit France against England, and kind of rip Europe apart. So Washington has to decide, what is my stance on the French Revolution? What is my stance on like the French versus the English? And also the French helped us in our fight. So, right? Jefferson is like, hey, France helped us, we need to help them. And his view of nature, of what he thinks is good, also kind of lines up with the French Revolution. Jefferson is like, listen, I have, faith in the common man. I have faith, I actually align myself more with the common man than I do with these elites. The Federalists are really afraid. The Federalists look at the French Revolution and they are like, this is what happens when you give too much power to the hands of the citizens. They're going to, take people's property. They are going to try to take away religion. They're going to try to take away, just like basically kill rich people. And so Federalists look at the French Revolution, they are like, this is the problem. We fear what they call mob rule, or tyranny of the majority. They fear that if you give too much power to poor people, they will take over and act foolishly. Whereas the Democratic Republicans and Jefferson were like, well, we kind of trust them more than we trust these elites. So the Federalists kind of thought the Reign of Terror was just perfect example of what happens when you put power in the hands of the commoners. And Jefferson is kind of like, well, I'm not afraid of, these sort of like uprisings. So the Federalists did not want to really support the French, and also they supported the British because they wanted to trade. And I think this is probably one of the biggest reasons why, is that these folks, the Federalists, they are focused on this trade. And we have never really broken away from British trade. You have our tobacco still going to England. You have, New England is still trading with England. And so these people who are trading, they really want to keep their ties with England because that's their major market. So two differing opinions. Essentially, Democratic Republicans support the French. Federalists, and also as Napoleon rises to power, is they are going to support the British. So these are the two sides. And the question is, what is Washington going to do? Now, Washington wants to remain neutral. That is his goal, right? He does not want to take sides in these European affairs. And really, it's this kind of American idea that Europe is always going to be fighting each other. This is not America's bag. We should just stay out of it. And he does try to do that. And he also warns against that in his farewell speech, which we'll take a look at later. But what he does do is he tries to settle things with England, and he's going to sign Jay's Treaty. And when he signs this treaty with England, France takes it as almost an act of war. And so although Washington is trying to maintain neutrality, he is seen as taking the Federalist side and siding with England in Jay's Treaty. So Jay's Treaty, I think this is my favorite, slight. It's like, damn John Jay, damn everyone who won't damn John Jay, damn everyone that won't put lights in his window, sit up all night damning John Jay. Why does everyone want to damn John Jay? Well, these are the Democratic Republicans. These are the ones who felt like we should side with France. When we sign this treaty with Great Britain, it is seen as being too pro-British, and we are going to go to war with France. And so a lot of folks are very mad with Jay's treaty, including Thomas Jefferson. It's been made public, so general bursts of dissatisfaction has never before appeared. We condemn these articles. We do not understand and condemn it as a warring and hostile face to France, right? So Jefferson felt like, we are taking the side of England, we are going against France, and we are basically supporting this monarchy. So when Washington leaves, he really sees the country being torn apart by these foreign policy questions, and he just says, these parties are tearing us apart. We need to basically, remain neutral. We should not engage in entangling alliances. He's afraid of political parties tearing us apart. He's afraid of treaties tearing us apart. And so when he looks back, he warns others to avoid entangling alliances. Economic policy is also ripping the country apart into two political parties. And one is this agrarian vision, which is the Democratic Republican. I don't know why I did this the whole time. And manufacturing, which is the Federalist. So we have Jefferson has this agrarian, which is just this agricultural vision. What he basically wants is a nation of self-sufficient farmers. So for Jefferson, what is the most stable form of government would be if everyone owns land. People who own land are going to be better voters. They are going to be better citizens. And, this is what we should that's our goal. He doesn't like cities. He doesn't like all these other things. And if all you want to do is have a nation of small farmers, you do not need a large government. You do not need anything. You just need to be left alone on your farms, and that's it. Now, Hamilton is going to have the Federalist position, and what he wants to do is promote manufacturing. And so to Hamilton, we keep importing all of these goods from England, and what he wants to do is start making our own goods in America and try to encourage manufacturing. He wants to get capitalism going in the United States. He wants to urbanize. He wants to do all of these things. He wants to have merchants and bankers and wealthy farmers and manufacturing. And so this is what he wants to do. And to do that, he is going to make his plan. But there are two different visions of what the United States should be. And so, Hamilton is going to put forth a plan to help support manufacturing. They also have different constitutional interpretations. Again, if all you want is farmers, they were leave us alone. We have a very strict constructionism, right? Meaning, Jefferson is going to interpret the Constitution as it is written. So there's a list of powers that say they give Congress. These are called enumerated powers. It's declare war, raise money, to tax, right? All of these things that we gave to the government. Nowhere in that list of powers does it say you can make a bank. So to Jefferson and these strict constructionists, they are hey, it's not in there. We cannot do that. Because the 10th Amendment also says that all powers not given to the federal government are reserved to the states. So Jefferson says it's not in the Constitution, we can't do it. Now Hamilton and the Federalists are going to be well, in the preamble, we have to promote the general welfare, and there is elastic clause, necessary and proper. So there is a part of it that says you have the power to do everything necessary and proper to carry out the above duties. So since we have to raise public money and oversee proper expenditure, we need a bank. So this loose constructionism of the Federalist is hey, we can have a bank because it's necessary and proper. We can stretch the Constitution to do that. So Federalists are loose and Democratic Republicans are strict in their philosophy, right? So this also goes to their fears, right? The Democratic Republicans, their biggest fear is tyranny, is monarchy, right? And their kind of idea is the government that best governs is that governs least. They want limited government. And the Federalists want to kind of emulate the British. They're a little bit less scared of restricting freedoms, and they want more federal power to tax, right? We need to do all of this. They fear mob rule. They fear of what happens if you give too much power to poor people. And when they talk about minority rights, they're talking about rich people. So they want to make sure they are protecting the property and interest of the elites against the poor folk, right? So Hamilton's financial plan is put forward, and what he wants to do is assume debt, make a tax on whiskey to help pay down the debt. This is called an excise tax. Create a national bank to have stable currency. And this is going to be signed into law by Washington. And so the idea is that Hamilton is going to pay down these debts of states who have not paid it back to restore full faith and credit. If you remember things like Rhode Island paying off their debt in like worthless money, you have a lot of these other states who didn't pay off their debt, but then you have places like Virginia that worked hard to pay off their debt. So they are really mad that we're going to assume the debt of these irresponsible states, and then we all have to pay it off with a whiskey tax. They're going to raise revenue through tariffs, which is a tax on imports. And this tariff is a really important part, because if we put a tax on English goods, if we put a tax on English textiles, we will make our own textiles. So southern states already paid off most of their debt, and they have to be convinced. This is why we get Washington, D.C. in the South rather than in Philadelphia in Washington, D.C. So all these things get passed, and Washington supports Hamilton's plan, but it does lead to the Whiskey Rebellion. Let's see if we could talk about the Whiskey Rebellion. So in the back country in Pennsylvania, we talked a little bit about it, not that much, but in the back country of Pennsylvania, they are wheat farmers, right? So you would have like all this wheat, right? And I don't know, right? If you had any extra wheat, you would have to put it on a cart, and like, I don't know, this is a horsey, right? And if this is a farmer, right? What is he going to do with this extra wheat, right? There's nothing I can do with it. I'm a backcountry farmer. It is going to cost too much money to take this wheat anywhere else, right? The transportation sucks at this time. You're in the backcountry. You're in the hills of the Appalachian Mountains. You cannot do anything with this wheat. You cannot trade it very well, right? It's not very easy. So what are you going to do with all of this wheat? Well, you're going to create it and make it into a barrel of whiskey, right? Now, these backcountry farmers are are Scots-Irish folks. They know how to make whiskey. So they take all this hay, all this wheat, right? And then they're going to make it into whiskey. Now, this whiskey holds its value. It never goes bad, right? It is taking like something of value, and it is stable. So what happens is whiskey actually starts to equal money in the back country. So if I was a farmer and say my horse died, oh no, and I need to get another one, right? I would actually trade whiskey for another horse. I'd be like, okay, here's like 4 barrels of whiskey for that horse. And then people used whiskey as money. So people had a lot of whiskey in the back country, but they did not have a lot of money. Now, I don't know if anyone sees the problem here, is because now the country is going to ask that people pay a tax for making whiskey. So in a place where whiskey is money, if you put a tax on whiskey, they can't really pay it because they have a lot of whiskey, but they don't have a lot of money. This is very confusing. But anyway, essentially, the Scots-Irish backcountry farmers are going to get mad because whiskey is like their money. And when someone asks them to pay them money for the whiskey, and they have whiskey but they don't have money, they get mad and they consider this an unfair tax. The other thing is big distillers like Washington himself had like loopholes that they did not have to pay this tax as much. So anyway, of course, if you think a tax is unfair and you are a good American at this time, what are you going to do? You're going to tar and feather tax collectors. You're going to riot. You're going to do all of that. So the Whiskey Rebellion is about whiskey. That makes it easy. It is about this excise tax that they thought was unfair. Now, what is different is that now we have George Washington, who's like literally going to get on his like white horse that he fought in the Revolution with and like run down to this Whiskey Rebellion, and he is going to put this thing down, right? Unlike Shays' Rebellion, where there was no federal army before the Constitution, this is a good comparison point because during the Whiskey Rebellion, we are more secure. We have an army, and Washington is like, nope, and he puts it down. Now, where are all these like Scots-Irish whiskey makers gonna go? Well, they keep trying to avoid their taxes, so they move further west into Kentucky, kind of further away anyway. So here is the deal. This is kind of the big overview. Federalists are going to be elites, right? Loose constructionists, necessary and proper. Yes, they want a Bank of the United States. They are much more pro-British, and yes, they want to assume national debt. Democratic Republicans are more farmers. They are rural. They are in the West. They are strict constructionists, and they believe in like the 10th Amendment that says it's reserved to the states. They do not want a Bank of the United States. They are much more pro-France, and they do not want to assume debt. So again, Madison, this is the first political party, right? When Madison is talking about the Constitution, he is like, yes, I want to, right, have a new Constitution. And he is there with Hamilton, right? But when it comes down to the interpretation, he aligns himself with the Democratic Republicans. He is like, listen, if I wanted to have a bank, right, I would have written it in there. I'm like the father of the Constitution. I wrote the stupid thing. If I wanted a bank, I would have put it in there. No, you can't have a bank, right? And so it is a good example that the first political party system is not the same as Federalist and Anti-Federalist. It is the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. We will never speak about the Anti-Federalist after 1788 or 89. All right. So, I don't know. This is too crazy. Don't worry about it. Federalist era. This is the Washington administration. So, although we say Washington did not have a political party, he was nonpartisan. And we know that because he had Hamilton and Jefferson both in his cabinet. He kind of consistently sides with Hamilton. Jefferson is going to resign as Secretary of State. He does try isolationism, but he ends up siding more with the English. So even though Washington is not aligned with a political party, we usually put him in with the Federalist era. And that is going to continue after, because Adams, the other Federalist, is going to be elected president after Washington. Now, the weird thing is under the original Constitution, the runner-up is VP, so Jefferson is actually Adams's VP. When Adams is president, because of Jay's Treaty, people are afraid of war with France. This is an issue. France is seizing American vessels. France is stealing our stuff. This is France, like, ransacking our national treasure. We send some diplomats to France to try to settle things, and they do not meet with our American diplomats. This is seen as a slight. Now, the people who met them are called X, Y, and Z, these diplomats, and they call this the XYZ affair. They demanded a bribe for them to be met with the American ambassadors, and we almost go to war with France. So, you know, the Democratic Republicans, this is their worst fear, is that we will go to war with France. And John Adams looks like we're starting to get there. And as people are afraid of going to war with France, the Democratic Republicans are seen as siding with France. And so what John Adams is going to do is he makes it illegal for anyone to speak out against the government. And you have to think about the fact that at this point, the Democratic Republican papers are slandering John Adams. They are like saying, we are going to go to war with France. They are supporting these things. And he's like, you cannot do this. So he creates the Alien and Sedition Acts, which makes it basically illegal to speak, write, or print anything against the president, which all he's going to do is jail Democratic Republican folks. The other thing is he is going to try to deport dangerous foreigners, all of which are French. So folks are going to get very mad at the Alien and Sedition Act. It goes against the First Amendment and all of these other things. And so John Adams kind of goes too far with the Alien and Sedition Act and makes people very upset. And essentially, people like Jefferson and Madison are going to declare the Alien and Sedition Acts are unconstitutional, and they basically say that states do not have to follow this in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. So, in the election of 1800, the Federalists are going to try to paint Jefferson as, you know, looking at his personal flaws, like, hey, he raped Sally Hemings, or, they would call it like an affair. They point out his hypocrisy of writing the Declaration and then owning slaves. They went after him for being a godless deist. They said, look at him. If we elect him, we are going to have mob rule. It's going to be like the French Revolution here. It's going to be the end of the world. And also for being godless. And so Jefferson was a deist. He believed, like many kind of the founding fathers, he's basically an atheist, but he believes God is a clockmaker. He actually took the Bible and edited out all the miracles. And so that's why they made fun of him for being against that. And you have like the Democratic Republicans claiming that John Adams is like a hermaphrodite. We will judge without regard the prattle of the president. The prattle is strange, compounding ignorance and ferocity, a deceit and weakness with regard to the hideous hermaphroditical character, which is neither the force and firmness of a man or the gentleness of a woman. These people are slandering each other in their own like papers. So you had Democratic, Republican newspapers, you had Federalist newspapers, and they just slammed each other all the time. Now, 1800 is going to be called the Revolution of 1800 because Jefferson is going to win presidency. In this cartoon, it's like, Jefferson is trying to burn the Constitution. God is like looking down and being like, stop, you are the end of the world. You are going to like burn the Constitution in this like altar to despotism, like the French Revolution. This is a letter he wrote to a French guy, right? So to the Federalists, they thought this was like the end of the world. Jefferson is elected in 1800, and this is like everything is over. So that is basically where we will take it out to before our quiz. Yeah, I hope you guys do well. Take care.